So game dev is pretty hard. So if you're familiar with game dev, that might not actually be that surprising, but what is like the hardest aspect? The programming, the art, the design? Well, one of the hardest parts for me that I've realized recently is just actually having a plan on what to work on next, which is especially vital for solo indie developers like me. For example, for my game Castlemancer that you should definitely wishlist over on Steam, that the first devlog I actually released like 5 months ago or something, the game has changed so much that it's difficult to determine kind of what I actually need to work on next. It constantly feels like I'm adding things or rearranging different things or completely removing things. So the original idea for Castlemancer was literally just to be like a text-based adventure game almost. Basically, you were the king of this castle and there would be different choices that you would have to make for different events, and depending on your choice, that would affect the ultimate gameplay or other choices you would have to make. It was literally just meant to be a single screen, like just the throne room, for example, and it's just a picture of you as the king and different events would come up. So I originally thought my game was gonna take like a month or so, a month or two to fully flesh out and just like release either completely for free or like a few bucks or something. But boy, was I in store for a pretty rude awakening. So while I was working on the game, I thought, hey, instead of just events, you should manage resources. So I added resource management type functionality to the game. And then I realized like, hey, just selecting buttons for different resources wasn't super fun, so what if I made it like a card system where you can like play different cards to gain different resources? So I added a card system. And at this point, it almost became just like a regular tabletop game where different events would come up and you could play cards to gain different resources in reaction to those events. Then I thought, well, hey, a single throne room is not super fun, so what if I gave like a broader view of the castle with like little guys walking around to just make it a little more immersive, but they don't really need to be connected to anything. So I made a tile map and added the castle to it so that you can kind of see what was happening outside the castle. And if you thought I was done just constantly adding things, buckle up. So then I thought, okay, well, besides just like random events and resource management, which is, you know, kind of fun, what if we added actual gameplay or actual like combat? So I added an enemy army with a health bar, but then I was like, okay, instead of just some broad term, I actually want to see the actual individual units that make up this enemy army that's attacking your castle. So I added just a bunch of random like sprites walking outside the castle that basically represented the enemy. But with enemies, you need to be able to attack them, so then I had to actually add like offensive and defensive spells in addition to just the resource cards that I had before. But with offensive spells, I want to be able to actually see the spell in action when I play it, so I added the functionality where a spell, depending on which card you played, would just kind of cast randomly somewhere on the battlefield and may or may not hit some enemies that happen to be walking around. And then I thought, hey, random falling spells from the sky and may or may not be hitting enemies is okay, that's kind of fun, kind of goofy, but what if we actually made it where you could target what area you wanted the spell to hit? Then once I had that, I was like, okay, there's definitely gotta be more cards and gameplay than just sending spells out and having random events happen. So then I changed the theme of the game. So instead of a king in a castle, you are now the headmaster or the archmage of like a wizard or wizarding school. And depending on which students you actually enroll in that school dictates what spells you'll have access to play against the enemy. Then I realized, hey, resource management actually isn't fun to me, so I just gutted that entire feature. And then I thought, okay, well, one single camera is okay, but what if we had two? One outside the castle that shows kind of the combat footage, and then one inside the castle that kind of follows your player being able to walk around. So I added a castle interior, a player controller, and now the camera follows the player and you get an outside view of the battlefield. And lastly, I wanted my game to be really replayable, so I added more roguelike features and deck building type of features to the game. And that brings us to more or less where we are today. And I haven't made a ton of devlogs about Castlemancer, mostly just because of how much it's changed throughout the past, 5 or 6 months. Literally from one day to another, having massive feature changes. Basically on what I thought was fun. Because if I don't think it's fun, I'm not gonna like give it out to playtest to other people because I already know it's not fun. Like I wouldn't wanna play it. So again, that long-winded story brings us to here on why I'm sitting at this table instead of my like usual narration at my desk. Well, I thought it could be helpful for both me and you to kind of just think about how to think about what next to actually work on. Because of all these changes, it just makes it really confusing to think about, okay, what do I actually need to like build now? And kind of where I can just write it all down. So throughout that massive iterative design process in the last 6 months, I built a lot of the back-end systems. I guess in terms of sort of like a metaphor, it would be like if you're building a house, I did a lot of like the electrical and plumbing work, but I didn't install any of the light switches or toilets, for example. So all of that kind of necessary stuff in the back end for things to work exists, but the things that actually use those systems, I haven't added yet.
Quick pause, I just wanted to briefly mention something that can really help out your side projects like game dev, and that's this video's sponsor, Datastax AstraDB. AstraDB is a vector and NoSQL database that you can spin up instantly and at scale. But why is this helpful when it comes to game development? Well, AstraDB is massively scalable and highly available. So if your game becomes the next World of Warcraft, it can easily accommodate millions of players. And with low latency read and writes, players won't have to worry about lag or stutteriness. Additionally, AstraDB supports a wide variety of APIs, so it's hugely flexible with different gaming platforms, and all that player and session data is secured with end-to-end industry standard TLS connections and encryption. AstraDB also has streamlined integration with all the major cloud providers like AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure. So if you're planning to really take your game architecture to the next level, then AstraDB helps make that job much easier. So please check out Datastax AstraDB with the link on screen, also in the description. And thank you to Datastax for supporting the channel.
So here's what I'm thinking. So number one is I want to add basic relics. And this relic system will be kind of similar to like the Slay the Spire relic system, where they're mostly just passive modifiers to how you play the game. The next thing I really need to add is a dialogue manager. This is just something I've been putting off, but I always like dialogue systems, being able to talk to people throughout the castle, talk to your students that are, wizards and stuff like that. It's also really helpful for cinematics or other gameplay features where you need, dialogue on screen to come up, or a tutorial, for example. Another thing I really need to work on is kind of refining what I'm calling my summoned troop methodology. So you actually have the option, and a lot of the systems again are already built for this, is that instead of just playing offensive spells like Fireball, for example, you'll actually be able to summon troops to help you on the battlefield. I need to think of just a solution to make that system a little bit more refined. So I really need to update the UI, so that is another necessary thing I need to do. I think just a lot of the in-game menus are kind of in a sort of intermediary kind of state. I need to update the loot system as well. I also need to refine the gameplay map. So again, in roguelikes, it's very common to have some sort of like overview of the entire game world, where usually you as the player are moving your way across, in Slay the Spire, you're going up levels, or in like Peglin, you're going to, different zones. So in mine, it's basically the same thing, but it's just in reverse. So instead of moving across the map, things are moving to you. So I thought it was kind of a fun mix-up of that kind of feature, and I think there's a lot to explore there, so I just need to actually kind of implement that system. I have a lot of the UI done for it, but I actually need to create these different situations. Another really fun thing I wanted to add was a weather system. Basically, it just makes combat a little bit more engaging, a little bit more flavorful, or have a little bit more randomness, where, if it's raining, maybe fire spells are less potent, or maybe if there's blizzarding, then fire spells are more potent. And implementing this system will actually allow me to expand it to have troops with specific like elemental attunements, for example, where maybe certain enemies are more susceptible to fire damage, for example, and that's basically just an extension of the weather system. And then lastly, the other main thing I need to do, besides like tutorials and like making sure there's no bugs and stuff like that, is I need to add enemy variety. So I think it'd be really fun to have a lot of different types of enemies. So that's the list I kind of got right now. You probably can't read it because my handwriting is incredibly messy, but obviously there will be more bugs that pop up and I'm sure I'll have to readjust this, but having a, just a set list in front of you, and I highly suggest that you do something similar, whether it's on a whiteboard or it's on a piece of paper or it's on a Notion page. I also have a lot of this in my Notion page for my game. Just having it all in front of you makes it a lot simpler because I'm juggling so many different things in my head, not only just with the game, but also YouTube, and I have a full-time job and personal life, so being able to kind of free up some of that mental real estate, I think is really valuable. So if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, maybe just sit down again and just kind of try to write things out. And this could apply to kind of any project you're working on. And again, since my game has changed so much, it was so hard to figure out, okay, like what's the next step? So I hope you all found that useful. Definitely wishlist Castlemancer over on Steam. It really helps me out. My name is Michael. We do a bad British accent at the end of every video. Let me know what you thought about the video. Hopefully I see you in another one. That's all from me. Bye-bye.